Hello everyone, here's a new educational chess game, and I'll start by playing the pawn to d4. I'm playing against a player rated 1746 points, and he responds with d5. And now the move c4, this is what's called the Queen's Gambit opening. The idea is to lure the black pawn away from the center, but my opponent plays e6, reinforcing his central presence and protecting the pawn on d5. So I play knight to c3 to increase the pressure on the pawn at d5. Usually black plays knight to f6, and that's exactly what happens in this game. And as you can see, he protected his d5 pawn with the e7 pawn moving to e6, leaving the c7 pawn free to come to c5 and attack my center. So that's kind of the idea for white. And now I'm going to capture on d5. Why? If he recaptures with a knight, I can push e4 and have a central majority. So he recaptures with the pawn to keep control over the central e4 square. But now, pushing the pawn to c5 would be less favorable for him, because exchanging the d4 pawn for the c5 pawn would leave him with an isolated pawn on d5. And actually, I'll start with bishop to g5. I'm pinning his knight, and I'm even threatening to take his knight, because if he recaptures with the queen, he would lose the d5 pawn, and if he recaptures with the pawn, it would ruin his pawn structure. That's why he inserts the bishop to e7. In case of a capture, he can recapture with the bishop on f6. And now, I'm going to play my pawn to e3, and sometimes even the queen to c2 is played. But I'm going to start with the pawn to e3, with the idea of putting the queen on c2, the bishop on d3, targeting the pawn on h9, with the possibility of eliminating the defensive knight at any moment, and placing my white knight on e2 instead of f3. Why? Because in this position I have a central pawn majority. I have two pawns against one. But I'm not looking to push the pawn to e4 on its own. First of all, it's complicated, I could lose it. And even if I manage to protect my pawn and advance to e4, the exchange would create an isolated pawn on my side. So I'm looking to play f3 and then push to e4, and if there's a capture, recapture with a pawn to have a pawn duo, and incidentally open the f-file for my rooks. So I move my queen to c2 with the idea of placing the bishop on d3 and the knight on e2. I can castle queenside or kingside, and I keep the f2 pawn free to play f3 and e4, the central breakthrough. If my opponent tries to react with a c5 push, the exchange of these two pawns would create an isolated pawn on d5, and the rook, for example, could come directly to attack this isolated pawn with the help of the knight. He plays c6, preferring to solidify, so I play bishop to d3. I have the threat of taking his knight to capture the pawn on h7, so he will probably play h6 in this position, or play knight to d7 to give his knight a support point. He plays h6. I could exchange the dark squared bishop, but it's better to play bishop to h4 and keep this alignment. He plays knight to d7, coming to defend. Also, if I want to play the plan f3 and e4 later, I'll weaken this dark diagonal. So I don't want to trade my dark squared bishop for a knight and leave him with the only dark squared bishop on the board. I play knight to e2. There we go. I keep him guessing, will it be kingside castling or queenside castling? He plays rook to l8, and now I think I'll just castle kingside as planned. Another plan here for white is what's called a minority attack. Because I have a pawn minority on the queen side, I have two pawns here. Against three pawns, there's even this pawn structure, which is very solid for black. But I can play rook to b1 to push the pawn to b4 and look for the breakthrough with b5. And even if he plays a6, I play a4 and then the breakthrough with b5 to attack c6 and try to damage his pawn structure. He plays queen to c7, which is surprising because the queen is directly facing mine without any protection. If his knight on f6 wasn't there, I could capture on d5 and he wouldn't be able to recapture because of the queen. But if knight takes on d5, he can recapture with the knight. Bishop takes, rook takes, and I would have lost a piece. And if I play bishop takes knight, he'll recapture with the knight and still keep the protection of the pawn on d5. I could also play knight to b5, he can't take, but he can simply move his queen. So in this position, I'm going to leave this face-off as it is. I'm not taking advantage of it right away. I'll wait to see what he plays. Maybe he'll play knight to f8 to free the bishop, and at that point bishop takes, and then knight takes d5 would become interesting. And so in this position, I'm looking to play f3 in order to push it to e4. Now if I play f3 and he retreats the bishop to f8 with the attack on the pawn at e3, am I able to play e4? Yes, I can play e4 pawn takes. It's well enough protected. So I'm going to play f3. I'm preparing the e4 push. The idea is to exchange pawns push to e5 to drive away the knight, and open the f-file to attack the pawn on f7, and why not double the rooks on this attacking file. So, as we said, he can't move the knight because I can give up the dark squared bishop to win the pawn on d5 due to the pin on the c-file. If he plays g5, well, I would definitely move my bishop to g3 to attack his queen, or maybe even to f2, but certainly to g3, especially since after g5, bishop to g3, if he plays bishop to d6, I always have this idea of knight to b5. But now, he just played bishop to d6 himself. He's attacking the pawn on h2, but now he's also attacking the pawn on e3. I didn't think of this move. Bishop to d6, which attacks h2, and also attacks e3. I wasn't vigilant enough, and now he's attacking both. I think I'm going to let him take the pawn on h2. I'm going to play e4, and after bishop takes h2 check, king to h1, and he has to be careful about the e5 push. The e-pawn is more important than the h-pawn, because the e-pawn is the pawn of my central majority, and it's what can allow me to launch the attack, even if I lose the pawn on h2 in the process. So I'm going to play e4. I wasn't careful enough there with the pawn on e3 and the pawn on h2. I didn't think about this move, bishop to d6, which creates these two threats, opening the file and attacking the pawn on h2. I was mainly focused on my own ideas, and the move queen to c7 I found it surprising to put the queen opposite mine. And as a result, I lost focus. So now, I'm still threatening e5, attacking the knight and winning the bishop since the queen won't be protecting it anymore. And he can't bring the bishop back to d6 because of the push to d5, which creates a fork. So this is interesting. Maybe in the end it's an unintentional trap on my part, but it was a trap to let him take the pawn on h2 to activate my majority. But in any case, that's what I wanted to do, to push e4 no matter what. Well, here I lost the pawn on h2. We'll see if he can solve the problem with his bishop. So he takes on e4. I recapture with the pawn, I open the f-file, and that e5 push is still there. And you see, as soon as there's a central majority, it's very dangerous for him because he doesn't have a pawn in the center, so he can't block this e5 push that drives away the defensive knight that opens up this diagonal. Even if it's not that interesting for me to go into h7 immediately, I would of course prefer my queen to be in front, but I open the f-file to attack the rook. And sometimes the bishop and the queen can reposition themselves on this f-file if the knight is no longer there. He plays g5, so he's attacking my bishop. I can't retreat my bishop to g3 because he can capture twice, but I can pull it back to f2. It's a shame to block the attack on the f-file. I could go to e1 to reposition later, with the bishop to d2, why not? He has also given his bishop the f4 square. With the bishop on e1, he could play bishop to f4. But then, there will be a capture, and he'll have to recapture with the pawn, which still ruins his pawn structure. Alright, let's play bishop to e1. We leave the f-file open for the rook. I still have this e5 threat, which would win his bishop. I can reposition the bishop to d2. When the pawn is pushed to e5, it frees up the queen and the bishop, the diagonal, but above all, it opens up the e4 square, so the knight can also join the attack. So, he won a pawn, but his kingside has been weakened mine too, of course, but I have more strength to attack his king. Why? Because I have the open f-file, and I have this central pawn majority, which gives me a space advantage. So as a result, I have more pieces capable of leading the assault. He plays knight to e5, that's interesting. So here I'm looking at the e5 push. That way, I cut off Saddam's bishop from communicating. Alright, I push to e5. Now his bishop is under attack. The f7 pawn is also vulnerable. I'm going to look to play queen to b3 or bishop to c4 to attack f7. I could also sacrifice, play rook takes f7, king takes, and then bishop to g6 check, attacking the king, the rook, and the knight. That would be very interesting. And why not bishop to h7 check? With the idea that if he wants to protect the pawn, for example king to g7, rook takes f7 check, king takes queen to g6 check. Now, he's looking for squares, you see. I'm not far from checkmate, but he puts the bishop on f4. So now, I'm considering pushing to g3. If he doesn't want to lose his bishop, he has to move it to e3, and I can go for captures on f7 or attacks on f7. So I'm going to play g3. The knight and the bishop are protecting the g3 pawn. And what I want is for the bishop to clear the file, so I can have this idea of sacrificing on f7. So bishop to e3, rook takes on f7, king takes bishop to g6 check. Or, as we said, bishop to e3, we start with bishop to h7 check. He can go to h8, but then he would lose the pawn on f7. I'm not sure which is best, actually, how I'm going to sacrifice. He took on g3, so now he's giving me the piece. We'll look during the analysis. If he had come to e3, how should the attack have been launched? Actually, if he had come to e3, I could have simply played rook to f3 to attack his unprotected bishop and win it. But I really like the ideas of taking on f7. So now I'll take with a bishop or with a knight. Bishop takes, knight takes. I like recapturing with a knight because I know the knight can join the attack. Both of my knights can join the attack. You can see there are three possible plans. Knight recaptures, knight to h1, knight to f5, knight to e4, knight to f6, knight to d6. Now I have all the squares. So taking the pawn on h2 was ultimately a mistake for him because it allowed me to launch my central majority attack with even more force, since his bishop ended up trapped. So he just played knight to f8. The queen now defends f7. He also controls the h7 square. Now, I have a lot of interesting moves. Here I have a choice. Should I play rook to f6 to attack the pawn on h6? Should I play knight to e4 to reach the f6 square with check? Should I play knight to h5 to also control that square? It's difficult. There are so many possible moves. So here, I think there are several winning moves. I don't know which one is the strongest. I'm going to play knight to e4. So the key in this opening was to understand that when you have a central pawn majority, you can leave the f-pawn free, if possible, to try to play f3 and e4. And in case of an exchange, recapture with the f-pawn and thus have a central majority. And the central pawn majority can advance, push back their pieces, and open up the f5 for attack. This is a typical structural development in this type of position. This position is funny, because I no longer have any pawns protecting my king. I don't have an f-pawn, a g-pawn, or an h-pawn anymore, whereas he still has all three pawns protecting his king. But he's completely doomed because on the one hand I have an extra piece, but above all my pieces can converge on his king thanks to this central space. So he plays rook to d8, attacking d4. He wants to get out of a possible fork. After that I can still play the d5 push. If he takes with the pawn, I win the queen. And after the d5 push, if he takes with the rook, I have this move, knight to f6 check. The king moves, I take his rook, and he can't recapture because of the queen. After the d5 push, he could take the pawn on e5. Ah, that's a shame. I can also play knight to f6 check. If he goes to g7, he could get attacked by the other knight. And after knight to f6 check, if he goes to h8, he can't go to h7. There's the bishop. I have this queen maneuver to h2 to attack the pawn on h6 and create a pretty quick mate. So let's play it like that. Knight to f6 check. He goes to h8, and now I use the open second rank to go attack the pawn on h2, and here I'm threatening mate. He can put the knight there, but then I'll take his knight, protected by my knight and my bishop, and that's mate. If he goes to g7, there are possible checks. If I go to f5, he could take with the bishop, but I can go to h1 again to attack his king. That's what he does. He plays king to g7. So knight to h5 check, which will go back to h8. And in the end, I'm not making any progress. Alright, I'll go back to f2. Why? To protect the d4 pawn and play knight to f5 check. If he takes, I can recapture with the queen. That might allow me some infiltration, but his knight always escapes. He defends well. It's not so easy to make him crack. So I still have knight to h5 as an option. Knight to f5. Maybe I need to play king to g2 to also let the rooks come to the h file and sacrifice a rook on h6. I looked at sacrificing my queen on h6, but it didn't work. He just played bishop to e6. And now maybe he's looking to play bishop to d5. Alright, I'll play knight to f5, check. Here, he has to take. If I recapture with the queen, he wins the d4 pawn, but I think I have the attack afterwards with knight to h5, maybe taking on f7, we'll see. I don't have much time, so I need to play quickly. Knight to h5, heading to h8, queen to f6, and now we'll find mate on g7. He can go to h7, but then queen takes, rook recaptures with check. So he comes here, and now queen to f6, and now queen to g7 mate. Well, I still managed to find the winning infiltration. There you go, he resigned. So pay close attention to the analysis, because the game is actually fascinating. I missed quite a few things. Let's take a look. So I open with the pawn to d4. He plays d5, c4, the queen's gambit. He plays e6 to solidify, knight to c3. I attack. Knight to f6, he defends. And now I exchange on d5. And the idea behind this exchange on d5 is to neutralize the c5 push. Because if he manages to push that pawn, I could exchange and create an isolated pawn on his side, a centralized isolated pawn. And it's my move. So I play bishop to g5. I pin his knight, threatening to take his knight, followed by capturing on d5 if he recaptures with the queen. So he plays bishop to e7 to defend, which is standard. I play the pawn to e3. He castles kingside. I play the queen to c2. He plays the pawn to c6, bishop to d3. For now, the game is following a logical course. There have been many games in theory that have continued with these moves. h6 attacks my bishop. I retreat to h4. Knight from b to d7. Knight from g to e2. He plays rook to e8. I castle kingside. And here he plays queen to c7. And that's a move that made me think, because it's an unusual move in this position. What black usually plays is the move knight to e4. They come to establish themselves on this e4 square, offering a bishop exchange. If I don't want to lose my bishop, I can, for example, exchange it, but then the queen would recapture, supported by the knight on e4. It's not possible for me to play f3 to chase away this knight, because the knight will take, and then the queen can capture the pawn on e3 with check. That's how black usually counters this f3, then e4 push. So you can decide to take on e4 with white, but then you no longer have the idea of playing f3 and e4. But in the game, he played the queen to c7, and here I clearly see this queen to queen alignment. The fact that his queen is unprotected, but I can't find a way to take advantage of it. And amusingly, later in the game I could have taken advantage of it, but I won't think about it then, because I'm trying to exploit this alignment now. I'm searching, but it doesn't work. And I forgot a bit later in the game that it could have worked. So here I play bishop to f3, it's the logical move. He plays bishop to d6, and that's when I realized that my pawn on h2 and the pawn on e3 are both under attack. But in reality, losing the h2 pawn isn't a big deal. I sensed that pretty quickly during the game. What's important is to advance with the central pawn majority so that you can later play e5, drive away the knight, and launch an attack against his king. So I play e4, he takes on h2 with check, king to h1. He exchanges here on e4, and that's where he makes his biggest mistake. He's going to give up a piece by playing the move g5. He should have played knight to g4 to try to counterattack on e3. Not only does he protect his bishop, but he also anticipates the e5 push, since his knight would have had to move anyway, so he might as well do it right away, and he threatens that fork on e3. According to the computer, bishop to c4 is the best option, because even if he plays knight to e3 and attacks my queen and my rook, I could play bishop takes f7 with check, then save my queen, and if he takes my rook, he will also lose his own. So the advantage for white remains, but it's less serious for black than the push to g5, because the push to g5 greatly weakens black's kingside. So I retreated to e1. The computer says I should have played e5 immediately. I retreated to e1, and my advantage is still there, but it's less than if I had pushed e5. He should have always played knight to g4, but he plays knight to h5. And here I decided to push e5 to trap his bishop. He brings his bishop back to f4 and I play g3. And this is where I missed the opportunity to take advantage of his unprotected queen, because I could have played knight to d5. Now it works. I attack his queen and then I can take out his bishop by attacking it 3 times. But just like in the opening, I looked at knight to d5 a lot and it didn't work. I ended up putting that idea out of my mind. And on top of that, in this position, I was so focused on capturing his bishop that I forgot I could use the pin on the c-file to go after his bishop. So after bishop to f4, I played g3. He's going to take on g3. He's going to sacrifice his bishop on g3. He should have, on the contrary, sacrificed it on e5 to open up the position, but instead he wanted to strip my king of its last pawn. But it would have been better for him to sacrifice his bishop on e5 to open up the center and give himself some counterplay, even though he's done a piece. He would have had more counterplay by opening up the center. But in the position, he played bishop takes g3, so I recaptured with the bishop. He played knight takes, so I recaptured with the knight. He plays knight retreat, and I play knight to e4 to join the attack. but I could have played knight to d5 to attack the queen with tempo, still taking advantage of this spin and joining the attack on f6. It's funny that I completely overlooked the possibility of going to d5. So knight to e4, rook to d8, attacking the pawn on d4, knight to f6 check. He moves to h8. I shift my queen to h2 to threaten the h6 square with mate. He plays king to g7. And here I can't find the combination. I can't figure out how to continue the attack. And I go back to f2 and I miss a beautiful combination. So I'm going to invite you to pause the video to take the time you need to think about it, and we'll discuss it afterwards. So what did you come up with? Here, I forgot about the queen to queen alignment, and this alignment could have made me win. I should have pushed the pawn to e6. It seems strange to push this pawn to e6, because the bishop, the pawn, and the knight can all capture it. But the idea is to reveal the queen to queen alignment. For example, if he plays bishop takes e6, I can then play knight to f5 check or knight to h5 check and capture his unprotected queen. So you might say yes, but after this pawn push to e6, black isn't obliged to capture. But if they don't capture and, for example, move their queen to queen b6, well, I can use the f5 square without the bishop being able to take me now, since the pawn on e6 blocks it, and I can play knight to f5 check. And now the attack will prevail because afterwards I can capture on h6. For example, if he takes the knight, I can take on h6, but I have an even faster move, queen to e5 check, king to g6, and now with the bishop and king facing each other, I move my knight anywhere, say knight to g3, for example, and he has no squares left, there is no square for his king. So when I said anywhere, actually not just anywhere, because knight to g3 allows me to control the h5 square. But I could have also played knight to g7. The queen protects and I control the h5 square. It's not checkmate yet, he can play the pawn to f5, but then I just need to take with the bishop, and that will really be checkmate. So in this position, I forget about the queen to queen face-off. I should have pushed e6. But I have little time on the clock and I play queen to f2. In this position, he plays pawn to e6. Now knight to f5 check, he takes, I recapture with the queen. Here he takes on d4, knight to h5 check, and then he makes it easier for me by moving to h8 because I can play queen to f6 check and mate on g7. If, for example, he had gone to g8, how would I continue the attack? You have to understand that he's threatening rook to h4 check, attacking both my king and my knight. So I can go back to f6 to check. I can play bishop to e4 to block his rook, but I think the best move is rook to f2. If he plays rook to h4 check, I can block with my rook, and then playing rook to f2 opens the way for the other rook to come and continue the attack as well. And in this position, I have an extra piece and an attack on his king. I'm winning, but obviously he made things easier for me by going to h8 because that allows me to check and then go for mate. Well, I hope this game has been instructive, especially in the opening, with the idea of advancing with your central majority, pushing the pawn to f3, and then the push to e4. There were also some interesting tactical moments. Now, I missed the queen to queen alignment, maybe you noticed it during the game. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them for everyone. And you can also give me a thumbs up, share the video, and support the channel. We'll meet again soon for more educational chess games. Goodbye everyone.